From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is Nebraska Farmcast. I'm Ryan Evans. Today I'm joined by Dr. Brad Lubben, an agricultural policy specialist here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The major party conventions are over and election season is definitely in full swing, bringing speculation about what a new Congress and administration could mean for agricultural policy. In his latest policy report column for Nebraska Farmer magazine, which is published now online and will appear in the October print issue, Dr. Lubben explores some of the questions facing agriculture as Americans prepare to head to the ballot box this November. Brad, thanks for joining me again.
Good to be with you, Ryan.
So the Farm Bill is probably the first thing that comes to mind when thinking of ag policy, given continued delays in its passage. And you write that the key question right now could be more about the timing of the bill than the content of it. So what do you mean by that?
Well, we've been watching a Farm Bill debate now for some time. Early discussions in 2023 ultimately produced no bill, but just an extension. So we could start this debate over again in 2024, just in time for a federal election to commence. And so lots of difficulty in trying to get it to passage. We have issues in the bill itself over content, particularly in nutrition title and nutrition assistance in the conservation title, and some modifications in the commodity title as well. But I would argue that the debate over the content of the bill is less of an issue than the debate over the timing of the bill. There are fundamental issues and fundamental questions about how different parts of the Farm Bill might work. But the real question is, well, what about the funding? And to date, we have seen positions on funding. We have seen no sense of compromise or work towards a pragmatic solution. And in the middle of a campaign, it's hard to imagine that that's coming. So the real issue is probably the timing, and more it looks like the first opportunity really to talk about a Farm Bill is probably in a lame duck session after the election. And even then, there's questions about how much possibility there is for success.
Yeah, I imagine that depends on obviously the results of the election and what the makeup of Congress is at that time. But if the Farm Bill does wind up getting extended again, the 2018 Farm Bill extended again, does that have implications for producers and just for the ag policy landscape in general?
Well, the first instance to note is there's an adage that would say it's easier to campaign on what you promised than what you actually delivered. That's one of the reasons why it's hard to imagine getting a Farm Bill done before the election, because who's going to give up on principles now? We come to the lame duck session. Well, are people willing to be pragmatic and reach some compromise at that point? If Congress or if Washington is still split in terms of political power, it's possible to imagine a compromise to get it done, largely along status quo lines, and just get it off the floor and out the door so that it's not hanging over the next session of Congress. At the moment, either party has reason to think that it might gain more power in the next session of Congress and in the White House itself. And so there's a lot of reason to imagine that based on the outcome of the election, if either party is in line to control the next session of Congress, it's easy to imagine them saying, we're going to wait, because at least in the new session of Congress, we can reintroduce this legislation and do it, quote unquote, the right way. And so the chances of compromise themselves look somewhat thin, at least as long as or until we know how power shakes out in the new Congress and in the White House. Even if we don't do anything other than a simple extension, we still see policy that will change for producers in the coming year. A simple extension of the existing farm program would mean a continuation of current support programs, but under changing safety net levels, because the ARC program for producers changes every year based on moving average yield and revenue, yield and price components of the revenue guarantee. And PLC moves as well. There's a moving average price component of the reference price in there as well. And for at least the commodities here in the Midwest, that price is actually moving higher yet, even though current prices are falling substantially in the current year, the historical moving average is still trending up. And so the safety net in 2025 might look bigger than the safety net in 2024, even under a simple extension of current policy.
And in your column, you talk about a number of other key policy areas besides the Farm Bill, which I'd love to discuss here. And the first one is trade. So what are some of the key differences between the two major parties here and their trade policies heading into the election?
Well, you're right. To set that up first, it's to note that we'd talk about farm bills all the time, and it's quite possible with the ramifications of this year's election that the Farm Bill is a relatively minor item on the horizon in terms of what could really impact agriculture. And one of the first of those is trade. And it's not so much that the two campaigns differ dramatically on trade. It's that neither of them seems to be preaching trade negotiations and multilateral trade agreements and systems as a path forward. Vice President Harris, as part of the current Biden-Harris administration, has championed, or at least has pushed toward, some multilateral negotiations and discussions, but mostly about geopolitical relationships and sort of trade relationships, not about improving trade access, particularly through reduced tariffs and other improved access. The Trump administration, in its previous go-round in the White House, focused on trade not through many multilateral agreements, but mostly through confrontation and direct negotiation with competing countries to try and reach new agreements and promises of access and purchases. So neither candidate looks like they would pursue the traditional path of trying to grow trade through multilateral agreements and negotiations. It's a much less certain framework for what future trade opportunities might look like, even at a time when trade balances have actually turned negative and there's more pressure on U.S. ag exports than there's been previously.
You also note that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 has provisions that are set to expire next year in 2025. So what are you watching as far as tax policy?
It's a certainty that the next Congress has to deal with tax policy in one way or the other. The current provisions that were established in the 2017 Act have expiration dates, some of them at the end of 2025. And if they are allowed to expire, then some of those current tax rates go back up for individuals, for corporations, et cetera. For estate taxes, some of those provisions go back in place under previous rules. That implies a potential tax burden on future earnings and estates. Well, the challenge is to put new tax legislation in place next year. Even to simply extend the current provisions costs money, or at least it costs money on the budget. We could have almost sort of a philosophical debate about, do tax cuts cost money? Well, they reduce the amount of revenues accruing to the government. That counts as revenues in the federal budget calculations, and so technically tax cuts cost the federal government money. So trying to extend tax cuts means coming up with the money to pay for the costs of those extensions, the same way that you have to find money if you want to increase the amount of spending in a farm bill, for example. So amidst a rather challenging budget scenario in Washington, trying to figure out a path forward on tax cuts is about as difficult, or maybe much more difficult, than a path forward on farm bill spending and other programs.
And then energy and climate policy, likely to always be a contentious issue for the foreseeable future. How could election results impact the balance between regulations and then market opportunities for agriculture?
Yeah, energy policy and climate policy closely related in the sense of either regulating or incentivizing or creating market opportunities to try and reduce emissions, qualify for cleaner markets, help provide the nation's renewable energy supply. agriculture see some of those opportunities as great some of those markets as great opportunities. Reducing emissions to qualify for more valuable supply chains, or qualifying ag practices and commodities towards renewable fuels, particularly renewable diesel, and also sustainable aviation fuel. Those look like market opportunities, and that could be the next demand growth opportunity in agriculture. And yet those markets are fundamentally driven by policy more than they are by economics. Policy decisions about how to calculate emissions or how to calculate carbon intensity, policy decisions about which fuels have access to which markets and at what levels of tax credits or other preference. All of those really matter, even before we get to the point of figuring out how to produce and supply those markets. So there's an awful lot of policy decisions to be made and an awful lot of policy uncertainty about how those go, particularly given rather large differences between the two presidential candidates on what direction we ought to go with these kinds of policies.
And then labor and immigration issues, so important, critical to agriculture. What decisions will be facing a new Congress and a new administration?
Well, it's somewhat glib to say it's the same decisions and issues that have been facing us for years. Issues of immigration and security at the border, issues of immigration and the ag workforce and the broader workforce in general. But we've been dealing with these kinds of issues for many, many years, whether it's through legal immigration or through legal worker programs like H-2A, temporary worker, guest worker type programs, or whether it's how we deal with illegal immigration and undocumented immigrants and workers. Those are the same issues we've been dealing with, and we still haven't resolved them. There have been bipartisan efforts to try and identify solutions, or at least proposals, and yet there's not been any real movement towards a pragmatic or a consensus direction. Much like some of the other policy, it's easier to stand on principle and campaign about what you stand for or what you promise than it is to campaign on what actually gets delivered. And we always think that, well, in a non-election year, we can actually get through this. We haven't yet. One can hope that we find a way through it in the coming year.
And then I want to touch on something that you mentioned the last time we were together talking on a previous podcast, the notion that agriculture policy itself, particularly the Farm Bill, they're generally thought of as helping manage risk, but policy itself now might be at risk. So what you mentioned that as you close your column, what do you mean by that, and what does it mean for producers?
Well, it's just a sort of a theme of the whole column and maybe the whole policy arena these days. Typically, we would think of the Farm Bill as, well, that's where we have a safety net, and a safety net helps producers manage risk. And it's certainly true. The commodity program, the crop insurance program, disaster assistance programs all help producers manage some risk in agriculture. But it's also true to note that all of these policy issues, whether you talk about trade or taxes or labor and immigration or environment and climate issues, or the Farm Bill itself, the uncertainty of whether we will go this direction with policy or that direction with policy, or whether we will get it done or not get it done, presents a risk of itself. And so producers have to manage not just for this year and this year's set of programs and rules and tax policies and so forth. Producers have to make long-run decisions about their operations that include the risk of what's the policy environment look like for the next decade or longer. And so policy itself is a risk, and managing for risk means using the tools and the programs that help you manage for today. It also means positioning your operation so that it can be successful despite whatever path forward we might end up taking. How do you manage for potential alternatives in future trade policy? That might change what kinds of commodities you grow. It might change what kind of markets you pursue. How do you manage for potential changes in tax policy? How can you position your operation to be ready for what may or may not come down the road? That's the risk of policy itself. It's the uncertainty and dealing with how do you manage for alternative scenarios.
Well, that's Dr. Brad Lubben, an Extension Agricultural Policy Specialist here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We've been talking about what is in his latest column for Nebraska Farmer magazine, and you can find that column linked to in the notes to this podcast. It's on our Center for Ag Profitability's website at cap.unl.edu, of course on nebraskafarmer.com, and will appear in Nebraska Farmer's October print issue. Brad, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.